Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the economic status of the AP6 countries. And what we mean by that is, where do they fit on that economic system spectrum of being public versus private, whether being more command versus laissez-faire or socialist laissez-faire. And remember that we're dealing with a couple of concepts here. One is when governments engage in the act of privatization, where we make a government owned business or property more privately owned, when essentially the free market comes in and takes over businesses and property, and then the government becomes essentially more liberalized, more free. And the history of these countries has governments becoming more and less liberalized. Now, when the opposite happens and the government comes in and takes privately owned companies or properties and then making them a part of the government, that's called nationalization, and this is less liberalization. And so countries have swings throughout their histories when they become more or less economically liberalized through privatization or nationalization. So let's start with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, first of all, back during the British Industrial Revolution, it was intensely laissez-faire. It was closest you're going to get. Government was basically hands off. Corporations and businesses made a ton of money. Of course, they created a ton of economic growth and industry, but they did do it at the expense of things like child labor, really low wages, really bad working conditions. And so for many years, decades, the Industrial Revolution really didn't filter down into the middle or lower class developments. It took a couple of decades before that actually uh, bore fruit. Eventually, during the World War II, there is a commission that comes forward and they issue something called the Beveridge Report. And what it recommends is that the UK have womb to tomb overall social coverage. So this is where you get the development of things like the National Health Service. The government should provide an enormous amount of services to meet the basic needs of its citizens. And this Beveridge report really starts that. So in 1942, you start to see the nationalization of a lot of industries. And you have the creation of the modern welfare state. This is where a time period known as the collectivist consensus comes forward, and the government has a much greater impact in what happens to society. You have the development of Keynesianism, which is an economic theory that if you spend an enormous amount of money as the government, even if you deficit spend, meaning you go into debt, then you're going to increase demand because if obviously if you give that spending and that welfare down to people like welfare payments, they're going to turn around, they're going to increase demand within the economy, it's going to drive up tax revenue and obviously economic growth, and so then you're going to go forward. In a lot of cases, though, this creates a massive amount of state debt, which has a lot of problems going in a different realm because you do have to eventually pay off that debt. Then in 1980 comes Margaret Thatcher. She is the prime minister of the UK, and she goes the opposite direction and says, we need to start swinging towards free markets. This is known as Thatcherism. You start reducing government spending, less government intervention. You actually allow people to buy a lot of their own townhouses, um, and you downsize the overall issue of government. Uh, became a very polarizing figure in British history. Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher, who it was said that she took chocolate milk and regular milk away from kids in elementary schools, and that was like kind of her image or persona that she was this mean conservative person. Of course, the beginnings of the European Union start also in the 70s into the late 80s, and this is movement towards freer markets also. When the European Common Market, which where you get free trade between with using steel and coal within European countries. And the UK votes as a population to become a part of that. And that eventually becomes the European Union, which is 27 member states that have free trade, free markets that exist within the country, free travel, all of that kinds of things. So it becomes much more free market oriented. Now, the problem is that when you engage in something like this, you have to follow the rules that exist within the whole union, not just your country. And so that started to create alienation within the UK. And in 2016, you had a famous vote, and that's should the UK leave the European Union? And the answer in 2016 was yes. And that was called Brexit. And The UK left the European Union, and that kind of leads us to where we're at today. And today, the UK is a neoliberal welfare capitalist state. There's plenty of private businesses that are out there, but it has pretty strong safety nets. However, it has one of the lowest GDP growth rates in all of Europe. If you live outside of Oxford, London, or Cambridge, you're going to be significantly lower off and be lower classes. And of course, we have the timeline there of kind of free market to nationalization, privatization. Russian Federation, going back to the Soviet Union, which was insanely socialist command economy, they would develop 5-year plans, mainly around industrial, like cement production, steel production, and collectivist agriculture. um, those plans did create economic growth within the Soviet Union and killed tens of millions of people with things like famine and massive amounts of repression. So, a very socialist style economy. Perestroika starts under Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. When he comes in and he starts saying, okay, create limited privatization. Let's bring Western businesses into the Soviet Union and allow a little bits of small investment. And so you have this gradual during the mid to late 80s um, becoming more privatized. Then the Soviet Union falls and becomes the Russian Federation in 1991. You have something called shock therapy. This is when a economic system really fast, like literally overnight, goes from command to free market. And in Russia, we saw this in the very early 1990s. Basically, all those safety nets to the socialist system. I mean, everybody was poor. There wasn't really good economic growth. But then you took all those safety nets and overnight they're gone. And so it's the wild, wild west of absolute free markets. You see down here on this chart, life expectancy wasn't great under the Soviet Union either and going down, but all of a sudden it really drops off before Vladimir Putin actually takes power in around 2000. So shock therapy, sudden movement from command to a free market. Then, of course, Vladimir Putin starts tapping into the oil and gas reserves and nationalizing a lot of the oil, gas, and mining reserves within Russia. And then a lot of Europe starts getting their gas and oil from Russia, which makes an enormous amount of economic growth within the country. A rentier state, of course, that they are really dependent on the mining and oil for economic growth. But then you start seeing poverty start to shrink starting in 2001 and start to drop off. Um, After 2014, oil prices start to drop a lot, and since GDP is 60% of GDP is natural resources, this really hurts Russia, who is a rentier state. Then you have the war, and the war creates a massive exodus of male human capital because people did not want to be recruited to fight in the war against Ukraine. So all of these things contribute to being you're in a pretty rough condition in terms of the overall Russian economy. So you have nationalization, socialist state, then Gorbachev limited privatization, wild wild west under shock therapy in the 1990s. Then they started to reintegrate oil, gas mining, and then really under wartime, you started to see more and more and more businesses being nationalized. There is still economic growth due to the beginnings of the war boom, but a lot of the background things show that it's not going to last, and the war is going to really start taking its toll. And you're probably going to see a reversal of economic growth, probably within 1 to 2 years' time. Iran, Iran is basically a series of dictatorships from 1941 to 1979. You had the Shah, which was a Western aligned dictator. Pretty straightforward here. It is a rentier state, almost just massively dependent on oil. You had limited privatization and a lot of smaller businesses, middle class, what are known as bazaris, that really kind of dictated the retail industries within Iran. But in the 1970s, there was an oil crash. That oil crash made people, along with repression, really not like the Shah, who was a dictator. And then you had the Islamic Revolution in 1980, and you now have the Islamic Republic. And what they did is that you're still an oil or rentier-based state, but the Ayatollah Khomeini and the rest of the Islamic clerics basically nationalized the major industries that exist within the country, the banking system, financial system, and of course, all the natural resource oil and gas system. And a lot of that oil and gas is about 60% of the overall public sector economy. within the country. So it was more privatized. You still had oil and gas pretty much nationalized under the Shah, the dictator. And then since 1979, the Islamic Republic, you have a much more nationalized state. It's not a socialist state at all. It's a welfare capitalist state. So there's plenty of private businesses, but there's a strong government ownership. Notice I don't have safety nets in here because Iran economically conditions are really poor, high inflation, high prices, a lot of corruption. You have sanctions from economic sanctions for Iranian oil from the United States and a lot of Western countries. So the money doesn't really exist there to provide strong safety nets. And you will often see price fluctuations that are really bad. This creates a lot of protests. So it's a welfare capitalist state that doesn't have enough income to develop safety nets of a good welfare capitalist state. They just simply have government ownership of a couple of essential industries within the country. Okay. Next time we will hit the rest of the AP6.